Activist Gopal Krishna said something that struck me, and I'm quoting verbatim. The story of indentured laborers and coolies is the story of India's open veins and arteries. I've been reflecting on that statement, and I'm going to leave it at that stage. So the diaspora is an international phenomenon. We now celebrate it. We are in over 100 countries. In fact, there are very few countries in the world where there are no people of Indian descent. And the different histories of the diasporas have much to tell about international migration processes, political development, ethnicity, social and cultural change, etc. So there are different phases of migration, and I think the indentured fall under what is now called the PIO, People of Indian Origin, although I think the present Indian government and since 1990, the Indian governments have been interested in the NRIs because the NRIs are in US and Canada and UK, and they have dollars and pounds and euros to invest in India. I don't think people in South Africa, Mauritius, Fiji, and Trinidad and so on and can do that. So has the indentured tried to adjust in what one considers to be an alien and hostile environment? The indentured laborers encountered conflict with the colonial rulers as well as with the indigenous majority. And this tension, especially with the indigenous majority, persists to this day. And I'll come to that later in the presentation. So in the colonial and post-colonial eras, the Indian diaspora has raised questions of belonging. Were they partial citizens, pariah citizens, permanent minorities, resident aliens? Or were they simply excluded by race and culture from the possibility of citizenship altogether? What political rights did their economic contribution confer? And I think when Koshi was making that comment, I suspect that Uganda was very much in the mind. So these are some of the themes that influence this paper. There have been many fascinating studies about the diaspora in the indentured world, like Fiji, Trinidad, Suriname, and novels. And I think in terms of novels, House for Mr. Biswas would stand out. When I was in high school, I used to say, if you typics Trinidad and put Durban, it would be no difference. And I'm now getting my son, who's a university student, to read Biswas to understand maybe where we come from. I think one element that's missing, and this is a risk that I'm taking, I think there's been very few comparative studies. We focus on Fiji, on Suriname, on South Africa, Mauritius, etc. But I think there's a space for more comparative studies to be done, and I think they will reveal some common themes and challenges, and that's really, I think, if I'm making any contribution this morning, it will be that, the beginning, arguing for that comparative approach. I think the century since the official banning of indenture, I think the date was 12th of March, 1917. This juncture provides an opportunity for some critical comparative reflections on the challenges facing the indentured diaspora. One of the key contentions in this presentation is that Indians have constituted a vulnerable ethnic minority in the country of adoption and have been sandwiched between the colonial ruling class and the indigenous majority. And subsequent generations have often been considered aliens in their land of birth. A rhetorical question: what is the nature of connections with the motherland? I'll come to that later. In 1910, we had I can't call it a celebration, a commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the arrival of indentured laborers in South Africa. And I wrote a couple of public media columns where I spoke about slavery. And the so-called Indians were very upset with me, saying, "No, my grandfather was not a slave," and so there's a sense of people's dignity being impaired when we try to track our original roots. Another area of research that I think has been totally missing, and I hope I'm right, is there's been focus on the journey, but who engineered that trip? And it's the shipping line. And there's this famous shipping line called the Norse Lines. And there's a person by the name of James Norse who saw an opportunity to transport the coolies around the world. And he began to buy off other ships. I know of a scholar, Ashutosh, in Hyderabad, the Center for Diaspora Studies. He might have finished the thesis now. He studied the structure of the ship. I was amazed. He studied how the ship internal configuration to cater for regions, caste, and all of that. But I think the shipping company, I have not come across anyone who studied this, and if someone enterprising student looking for a good PhD or postdoc, I think this would be a very interesting area of research. Some pictures of the indentured in different parts of the world, and you notice the first three, Mauritius, Trinidad, and Fiji, look similar. Now you look at South Africa. Now, the reason I put this here is they were given numbers. They had no names. Now, my colleagues whose work you all might have known, sociologist Professor Ashwin Desai and a historian Professor Ghulam Wahid. Ashwin Desai told me about 15 years ago that he found this picture obnoxious because he's going to put a name to each one of those persons. And they do that in this book called Inside Indenture, which now you can download free if you're interested. The whole issue of return migration it's another theme that has permeated the research. The notion that after 5 years you can go back. But I like this comment by Dharwadkar. He says, while in theory immigration of indentured labor is voluntary and reversible, in reality involuntary, irreversible, and traumatic. So it was a transposition of colonial oppression in the home country to another. So displacement in terms of location, and that's where the geographical element comes in. The masters were the same in alien territories. So coming back to the contemporary, so we have the Guyana Chronicle, writing an editorial. And these days, because we live in the age of the internet, I don't know how historians react to that because it makes things faster and it brings the archive into your office and home. I tried to look at what was the reflections on people thinking about this. I only came across two brief comments. One was from Guyana, the other one was in Fiji. In my own country, nothing, So are we just passing the moment, or the academics are too busy with other things, etc.? So this indentured experience, according to the Guyana Chronicle, shaped that nation's tapestry, not merely for the various peoples who came under the professor system, but their diverse cultures and contributions. Now, this editorial comment could apply to Mauritius or South Africa or Trinidad, etc. And that's why I'm presenting it here. The conditions on the plantation life, etc., etc. But the last point, irrespective of outlook, none can deny indentured servitude was a debasement of human dignity and respect. And I thought that was a telling comment. To show we've done some research, this is a tabulation of the different regions where the indentured laborers went and the numbers, internet sources. I'm a geographer, so maps are important, and this shows you the different routes. And I'm really sorry about the key. I was trying to take a slide, take it on my cell phone, I messed up. But this shows you the flows of migrants, and what's important, and it doesn't come out clearly, is something called the twice migrant. For example, when after the Idi Amin saga, people then had to move to UK and other parts of the world, etc. And I may come back to that later. So I think the case for slavery is there, and I'm not going to emphasize it. I think we should accept it, and I think Hugh Tinker's point has been now, I think, vindicated. There's been a debate about whether there was agreement or not, and these are some of the sources I've used. Yeah, I thought since I'm working with historians, I should show them where I'm getting my information, and there's more of that. I think a neglected area of research when looking at indenture is the gender component. There's not enough done on gender. And I think it's linked to conditions under which people came. There'll be some unpleasant issues revealed in this. what did the unequal ratio mean between, one woman to 4 or 5 or 6 men? What did that mean? And coming from a culture where women were the bastions of purity, I think we were almost embarrassed to go into that area. But there's a book called Coolie Woman, the Odyssey of Indenture, I think tells the story very differently. And she makes a very important point that once in the territories, because of the unequal ratio, women had more power. They could choose who their partners or husbands were going to be. They could leave them at will, etc. So there's a lot of freedom. And I think in one of the chapters in the Inside Indenture book by Desai and Vahed, they also raise the same issue. But there was also abuse, violence, etc. I think that's an area that's been under-researched. And the other area that's been researched a lot, certainly in South Africa, is the indentured laborers were followed by the traders from Gujarat, or what we call the passengers, because they paid for their own passage. Now, certainly in South Africa, when the passenger Indians came from Gujarat, they were largely Gujarati-speaking Muslims and Hindus. They began to compete with the local colonialists in commerce, and that really set up the conflict in South Africa, and the reason why Gandhi came to South Africa was to actually represent one of those business people. And but there were also tensions between the indigenous communities and the indentured laborers from the time of arrival in most parts of the world where they went. And there's a reason for this. If you take the Zulus, if you look at conventional history in South Africa, the sense Zulus are lazy people, put that in inverted commas. And when you investigate it, they're actually very smart. They wanted a higher wages. So when the indentured laborers came, they pushed the wages down. Zulus were displaced, and that's the beginning of the tensions, the so-called Indian-Zulu tension, which still, I think, persists, below the surface. Now, the cost of indenture, the journey, etc., was expensive. So how do you trade off that? You pay lower wages, and that was the trade-off that the plantation owners did. And of course, the prosperity came with the increase in production. There's a lot of information about how, certainly in Natal, where when the indenture was stopped for a while because of complaints, the production went down, and then there was an agreement to improve working conditions, etc., and then indenture labor recommenced up to 1917. Then, if you look at Trinidad, there was friction between the the Africans who were brought in from Africa, etc. And you found that the former slaves were displaced, and Indians were seen as strike breakers, once again setting it up for tension. I then talk about one or two conflict situation, riots, and certainly in Devon. I won't go into the details here. But the point that has come out from the sociologists, that Indians occupy essentially a minority position, a buffer between the white colonial rulers and the indigenous majority. And so they get portrayed as scapegoats and villains in times of economic and political crisis. So coming to the present, socio-cultural isolation or racism. In spite of the distance and disconnection from India, you find that the descendants of indentured labor have maintained the cultural identity, religious identities. And for this, they have been labeled as being separatist or exclusivist. And there were Bhikkhu, who's now, I think, called Lord Bhikkhu Parekh in the UK. He identified 4 characteristics that were specific to the Hindu indentured laborers: the re-establishment of the family, the religious faith, especially the acceptance of the Ramayana, and the demise of caste. And now the Ramayana, because of this whole issue of exile and the hope of return, was very popular in the indentured territories. And given some of the religious dynamics right now in India, I mean, I think it was in Suriname, there was a Maulana, Munshi Rahman Khan, who actually introduced the Ramayana in that part of the world. Of course, I'm not going to talk about Hinduism, etc. It's an oral tradition and so on. But caste disappeared for a couple of reasons. One is they were on a common ship, sharing common utensils and space, etc. And also, I think when they arrived, you couldn't say, I'm from Bihar and you're from UP or Tamil Nadu. You were facing some common problems and common enemies, etc. I think all of these factors contributed to the breakdown of those barriers. But Utinka made another point and really asked the question whether Asians created their own difficulties with the way they lived and the notion of being separate from the main society, etc. And the notion of them being exploiters in alien societies, etc. And this was certainly an issue that came up in parts of East Africa. I think the other point to make is that the colonial authorities kept groups apart. The divide and rule strategy was there. The other groups didn't. I mean, even in South Africa, 20 plus years after democracy, I don't think we know the other communities as well as we ought to. So the barriers still exist. And certainly, I think one of the mistakes is the local indigenous communities don't understand the Indian cultural trends, etc. And that adds to conflict. So the contemporary dynamics, which I think is quite important, with the exception of Mauritius, where the indentured group is in the majority, in the rest of the indentured world, the Indians constitute a vulnerable minority. And one could talk, and I know there are specialists here. This is what Brij had to say, and I'm going to quote from him, when in 1972, a Fijian politician introduced the following motion in Parliament, that this House agrees that the time has arrived when Indians or people of Indian origin in this country be repatriated back to India, and that the traveling expenses back home and compensation for their properties be met by the British. Of course, and then in 87 and 2000, the Indian majority governments were ousted by coups, and you had abuse of ethnic identity, appeals to maintain privilege and power, and so on. And the type of affirmative action that was applied in Fiji disadvantaged people of Indian descent, access to universities, etc., etc. Now, some of these issues are coming up in South Africa right now. So what you have from Fiji is the secondary migration, largely to New Zealand and Australia. Now, in South Africa, following the euphoric democratic elections, there have been several public attacks against the Indian community, which played a major role in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. I was telling Professor Sinha earlier that some of you may know the name of Ahmed Kathrada. He went to prison with Mandela, and right now he's in a very critical condition in hospital. A disturbing theme in the attacks against Indians in South Africa is that this group, and I'm a third generation, so my son will be fourth generation, must return to India. For example, in 2002, there was a song called Ama India in Zulu, which called for strong, brave men to confront Indians. Whites were far better than Indians. We are poor because all things have been taken by Indians. And there was another incident where another song was written about the need for an African mother to give birth to another Idi Amin in South Africa. I missed that quote here. The last point I'll raise here is there was an essential market, it's a Warwick market in Durban, linked with the indentured laborers. And they wanted to actually destroy the market and replace it with a mall. And so this market had an umbilical connection with descendants of indentured laborers. And those opposed to the destruction of the market were taunted with chants of Hamba Kaya in Mumbai. Now in Zulu, that means go home, go back to Mumbai. And this was from renter mob crowds aligned to the ruling party. And I'm actually working on a book on this project. And even WikiLeaks, etc., quoted this incident. I'm coming rapidly to concluding. What's the connection with India? And how does India connect with the indentured diaspora? And my sense is that sometimes the indentured diaspora reminds India of a less sophisticated past. So the majority of descendants of indentured laborers have no links with India, except as some kind of abstract motherland. which I think many pilgrims find disappointing, as faith has been commodified and where religion betrays the poor and disadvantaged. After all, those in the plantations of East and South Africa, West and East Indies, etc., were low-caste peasants and laborers, unworthy of the attention of the Indian ruling elite. However, the indentured diaspora did impact on the Indian liberation, and Vijay Prashad makes the point that Gandhi learned satyagraha in South Africa. Of course, after 1947, and I think the other papers talking about this, and I won't go into details, the Indian government position and Nehru's public position was, you integrate with your communities. A very interesting paper. There's a scholar by the name of Nalini Mahabir from West Indies, and she wrote a paper entitled Zidi Log Aa Gaya. This is when after India's liberation, some people decided they're going to come back to India, and they got a very hostile reception, and some went back. Of course, since 1990, the Indian government wants to reconnect with the diaspora, and I think it was, as I said before, it was the NRI, that means the group that went here after more in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, professional business class, doing very well. But the Singhvi Commission, to his credit, they had to go all over. They couldn't say, now we're only going to the NRIs. They came to all the main areas where Indians were present. I think the interesting point was that an acknowledgement that the motherland could benefit from a form of Hinduism in the indentured diaspora, where people had rid themselves of tradition, custom like jati, sati, gotra and sutra and dowry. And so it'll be interesting if any lessons can be learned from the indentured diaspora. But there's a very interesting point that I think would apply to all Indians in the indentured diaspora. While this quotation applies to Trinidad, while Indo-Trinidadians insist on their commitment and loyalty to the nation of Trinidad and Tobago, they also express pride in the Indian ancestry. They don't see these two identities as necessarily being in contradiction. I thought that was an important point. And here, there was a reporter from the Times of India, I think, who had gone to Trinidad. And he meets this receptionist in a small village, in a hotel. She's playing a Bollywood song, and she doesn't understand the meaning, but she enjoys the song. And in the bulk of the diaspora, I think the languages have actually been lost completely. And this is why when I come to India, people don't know me, where are you from? There has to be a place connection, which part of India, otherwise the communication, there's a barrier. I think I have to make this point, given the current dynamics, I think, in India. Fundamentalism, how does Hindu fundamentalism affect the indentured? And Thakur Ranjit Singh, he's a blogger from Fiji. He said, this is a tranquil, serene, peaceful, calm face of Fiji, where all religions have been coexisting without hate actions, because all Girmitias went through the suffering and baptism of fire together, so they appreciate and respect each other. The fundamentalism and hard stance against Muslims and Christians is not welcome in Fiji. This is an alien culture and ideology. 20 years ago, in South Africa, the South African Hindu Mahasabha warned that Hindus should be worried about attempts to establish a branch of the VHP in our country. Any organization whose claim to fame is support for and participation in the destruction of a mosque has no place in our democratic society. Conclusion. I think Indians in the indentured diasporas have always been vulnerable in the colonial and post-colonial eras, and the connections with India is nebulous. There are significant continuities between both phases, and this included problems linked to race, ethnicity, citizenship, identity, which affects the descendants for the greater part of a century. There is also a significant degree of coalescence between race, class, and as the colonial authorities had defined and maintained ethnic categories and structured inter-ethnic relations to discriminatory regulations and institutional practices. The divide and rule strategy of the British persisted in the post-colonial era, where race and ethnic polarization have in fact become more entrenched in most of the former colonies, and the descendants of laborers appear to be as vulnerable as their ancestors, as the indigenous majority groups call for their repatriation. So a century since the abolishment of indenture, the tensions, conflicts, and prejudices of the era still persist in the 21st century, with third and fourth generation descendants likely to be victims. A critical question is whether they are likely to become twice migrants. Thank you.